In late 2011, officers from the Centre for Combating Extremism were investigating the desecration of over 20 graves in and around the city of Nizhny in central Russia. Their investigation led them to the door of a man called Anatoly Moskvin, and in his property they found a scene of utter madness and depravity. Scattered around the home were 26 mummified bodies of children and young women that Moskvin had dug up from their graves and lived with for years. He even spoke to these human dolls and watched cartoons with them. This is truly one of the most bizarre and disturbing cases you'll ever hear. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Anatoly Moskvin was born on the 1st of September 1966 in the city of Nizhny, which lies in central Russia. He was the son of Yuri and Elvira. Moskvin was described by his parents as a meek and socially awkward child, but they didn't help his development, and in fact, there were clear indicators of his parents showing some truly bizarre responses to situations in his early years, which would be relevant for later. So according to Moskvin, he was sexually abused when he was around 8 or 9 years old, and this led to him lashing out with frequent aggressive outbursts directed towards his parents. Whilst Yuri and Elvira apparently didn't know the trauma their son had experienced, they could see that something was very wrong, and their response was to back off, leaving Moskvin alone, limiting their contact with him. It appears they felt that ignoring the problem and distancing themselves from the source was the best course of action. This approach would continue throughout Moskvin's life, leading to his parents ignoring some truly gruesome behaviour. As will become clear, Moskvin became fixated with death, and he later reported that this stemmed from an incident in 1979 when he was 13 years old, when he was walking past the funeral of an 11-year-old girl called Natasha Petrova. He claimed that he was asked to kiss the body of the dead child, and when he refused, quote, "An adult pushed my face down to the waxy forehead of the girl in an embroidered cap, and there was nothing I could do but kiss her as ordered." He also claimed that the child's mother asked if he would marry the dead child, and had put a ring on his finger, signifying that the pair were now husband and wife. I'm very sceptical of this story, as we'll come back to later, and relying on the twisted mind of Anatoly Moskvin to give an accurate account of his life and the motivations for his crimes is a speculative proposition at best. Maybe this did happen, maybe it didn't, but Moskvin himself has made statements suggesting his fixation with death began earlier than this. He said years later, quote, "As a child, I had a book on ancient Egypt. While it no doubt depicted ancient Egyptians in a completely historically inaccurate way, aka white with a tan, the chapter I really loved was on mummies. Looking back, I should have realised my love of the macabre was lifelong, because I was 6 years old and fascinated with reading about the hook they used to slowly pull the corpse's brains out of its nostrils, and the urns they would keep the organs in, and the embalming process they used to preserve the skin. I loved the illustrations. I can still see them in my mind's eye." Moskvin would spend his teenage years visiting local cemeteries, spending hours in amongst the graves. This was his hobby. He was an isolated child and had few friends, and so he threw himself into his studies, and he excelled. He's a man who likely has a genius-level IQ. He graduated with a degree in philology, the study of languages and their development, from Moscow State University. He then pursued further areas of study, in particular focusing on the death rites and funeral rites of various cultures around the world. Moskvin was a renowned academic. He lectured and published expansively. He was also proficient in 13 languages. However, at the centre of everything was his obsession with the departed. Between 2005 and 2007, Moskvin claimed to have visited 752 cemeteries in Nizhny Novgorod, apparently to learn about these locations and to research the people interred there. He considered himself a necropolist, or an expert on cemeteries, and was a regular contributor to the Russian obituary newspaper Necrologies. Anatoly Moskvin was considered by others to be a brilliant man, but a complete enigma who was extremely private and appeared to have no friends. Little did the faculty members, his students, or the readers of his articles know what he was actually doing on his trips to the cemetery, and when this was finally revealed, it would shock and disgust the country. The exact timescale of the crimes of Anatoly Moskvin is not clear in many articles I've read. It appears, though, according to his own account, they began as far back as the early 90s, when he was in his mid-20s. This was around the time when Moskvin became interested in Druid practices and discovered they used to sleep on the graves of the dead to communicate with them. He also apparently found that some native Siberian tribes would do the same thing, and so he started sleeping on graves. But not just any graves, those of children. Not just any children, it was always little girls. This is a key part of this case. As well as Moskvin's obsession with death, he had a creepy, disgusting fixation with girls from around the age of 3 years old. He would scour obituaries of recently deceased female children, and if he found that the obituary, quote, spoke to him, he would travel to the graveyard and sleep on their grave. He was apparently waiting to see whether he sensed the spirit of the child wishing to be brought back to life. If he felt this, then he would dig up the child's corpse and lay with it. However, after a while, he was indifferent as to whether he felt this apparent connection and would dig them up anyway, and then sleep with the body of the dead child next to him. Over a 20-year period, Anatoly Moskvin is believed to have desecrated the graves of around 150 female children. It's not clear what he did with all of them. It's likely that after sleeping with their bodies, he would rebury most of them. But for his favourites, the ones he was clearly sexually attracted to, he would take them back to his home, the one he lived in with his parents, as he believed that with a more comfortable environment, the spirits of the dead children would speak to him. Moskvin returned back to his obsession as a child, the mummification techniques used by the ancient Egyptians, and began researching and trying to replicate their methods. He's reported to have used a combination of salt and baking soda to dry out the bodies. He would secrete vats of this near the cemeteries in isolated locations and place the corpses in them, and then return when they completely dried out. As to why Anatoly Moskvin wanted to make mummies out of children, he gave the most deranged explanations. One of the things he said was that he did this because he wanted to have a daughter, and his attempts to adopt one had been denied, so this was the next best thing. And this does appear to be the case. Moskvin applied on several occasions to adopt children. Well, more specifically, a female child, because he was apparently lonely and wanted someone to look after. Thank God he was blocked from adopting any child, as I have no doubt that he was simply trying to fuel his depraved sexual interests. And so, unable to do this to a live child, he then turned to the dead. Once the bodies of his favourite children were mummified, he would take them back to his house and dress them up, with some being made to wear stockings, dresses, and knee-high boots. Others were dressed completely bizarrely, including one who had the face of a teddy bear sewn onto her body. Moskvin drilled through the eye sockets of some of the corpses, fitting them with buttons so they could watch TV together. He would also sing child songs for them and offer them food. On the birthday of each of these dead little girls, he would organise parties where he would be surrounded by these monstrous creations. He also drilled into the chests of some of the bodies and installed music boxes so that when they were touched, they would play music. Apparently this, to Moskvin, was in place of a voice and made the children more lifelike. There was a hierarchy amongst the dolls, with Moskvin apparently showing favourable treatment to those who behaved. Those who displeased him were kept in the garage, whilst he apparently reburied some for misbehaving. After his arrest, Anatoly Moskvin made a big thing about how respectful he'd been to the children's bodies. He claimed he never took corpses that were not asked to be removed from their resting place, and that he'd always treated them like real children, caring for their needs, and that he'd never mutilated them. He also said that he never swore in front of them, because, quote, you can't swear in front of children, especially little girls. Some of the dolls were sat next to gravestones. It's not clear whether these were taken from the graveyard or whether they were made by Moskvin. One even had a hospital toe tag specifying the cause of death and the date the girl died. Moskvin would create detailed notes, including the name of the child, their age, and where he'd taken them from. He was also apparently practicing black magic in order to bring the children back to life. I always try as best as I can in these videos to humanise the victims, to reinforce that real people were affected, and I'll do so in this case. not only to show the absolute disregard for the sanctity of these dead children displayed by this sick man, but also his disgusting behaviour towards their parents, essentially mocking them. One of the children, whose remains Moskvin mummified, was 10-year-old Olga Chardmova, who was the daughter of Natalia and Igor. On the 2nd of October 2002, Olga insisted that she wanted to walk to her grandmother's house alone because she was a, quote, big girl, and her mother agreed. Unfortunately, before she'd even left her own block, Olga was spotted by a drug addict who was hanging around the foyer. He forced her to the top floor of the building and robbed Olga of her earrings. When she tried to escape, he hit her over the head with a metal bar, ending her life. The killer then hid Olga's body behind some pipes in the block's attic, where it remained undiscovered for 5 months. All this time, Natalia and Igor searched for their daughter and eventually had to come to terms with the fact that their little girl had been murdered. The grief they must have felt was likely indescribable, but their pain was only just beginning. Olga was laid to rest, but soon afterwards, Igor and Natalia noticed strange things happening at their daughter's grave. In May 2003, Igor erected a small fence around his daughter's grave. The next day he came back and found that it had been moved and a wreath had gone. The same month, a note was found on Olga's grave, signed by, quote, kind angel. For the next 9 years, notes were placed on Olga's grave several times a year. They would always be addressed to, quote, little lady, and would congratulate her on milestones in her life. They would wish Olga a Merry Christmas and birthday, as well as other events that she would never experience. For example, one said, quote, happy last month of your 6th year at school. These notes, written by Anatoly Moskvin, were also extremely threatening. On one, he wrote, quote, if you don't erect a great monument, which she deserves, we will dig her body out. He also took an axe to Olga's headstone on at least one occasion. Igor later said about this 9 years of torment, quote, imagine what it was like for us, her grieving parents, reading these notes about our murdered daughter. It was not at all like some sick joke, but a spear through our hearts. It wasn't until October 2012, the year after Moskvin was arrested, that the true horror was revealed. Using the detailed information they found in his property, they were able to determine that in May 2003, soon after Olga was buried and her father Igor noticed disturbances at her grave, Moskvin had dug down, broken open the coffin, stolen the body of this murdered child, replaced the soil, and turned her into one of his dolls. So her parents had been visiting an empty grave for 9 years. All this time, this monster had been living with her corpse. Natalia and Igor then had to be shown a picture of the monstrosity Moskvin had turned their daughter's body into. She went from this to this. Natalia later said that when she saw the picture of her daughter, quote, I almost collapsed. I felt sick. My girl had been murdered. If anyone deserved to rest in peace, she did. But instead, her grave had been robbed. I still find it hard to grasp the scale of his sickening work, but for 9 years he was living with my mummified daughter in his bedroom. I had her for 10 years. He had her for 9. Eventually, Olga's body was reburied in an undisclosed location, somewhere where she could rest in peace, as she deserved. This is the horror that was caused to dozens of families, having to be informed that not only had the bodies of their loved ones been stolen, but they'd been turned into the playthings of a sick, deranged pervert. Anatoly Moskvin engaged in his depraved behaviour for 20 years, but his activities would not go unnoticed, and eventually his sick secret would be exposed to the world. In 2009, locals in the city of Nizhny Novgorod began to report that the graves of their loved ones had been desecrated. The Russian authorities believed this was the work of a group of extremists trying to make some sort of political statement, and so it was investigated by the Center for Combating Extremism. For the next 2 years, police presence was beefed up in and around cemeteries in the area, but there were no leads. Russia is a vast country, and so Anatoly Moskvin simply moved his operation to another location. He He seemed to always be one step ahead of the police, but his days of freedom were numbered. How Moskvin was caught is frustratingly unclear. You know me, I like to be as accurate as possible, and I've scoured article after article, including ones from Russia from the time, but it seems like this was never disclosed. There's one explanation which appears in several articles, but I'm not sure it's correct. Specifically, it's reported in these sources that in the aftermath of the suicide bomb that was detonated in Moscow's Domodedovo airport on the 24th of January 2011, Moskvin was caught desecrating the graves of Muslim males in the graveyard. The articles I've read suggest that this happened soon after the attack, and this led to Moskvin's home being searched, but he wasn't arrested until early November 2011, almost 10 months later, so this cannot be accurate. Also, as we'll get to, the police came in force when they eventually broke in. It seems unlikely that finding Moskvin defacing gravestones would have prompted this response. Maybe this incident earlier in the year meant that Moskvin was on a list somewhere, and when further resting places were disturbed, the authorities connected the dots and came for him. Regardless of how it happened, on Wednesday the 2nd of November 2011, 8 police officers entered the home address of Anatoly Moskvin, and they walked straight into a nightmare. The inside of the property was filmed, and the place was an absolute state, squalid and barely habitable. In amongst the chaos were 26 dolls. Actually, let's call them what they were, 26 dead bodies, although initially it was reported there were 29. They were everywhere, on shelves, on the furniture. Some of them were not seen at first, because they blended into the squalor in the home. The house smelt foul, a combination of decomposing food and other items, as well as the unmistakable stench of death. As well as the bodies themselves, the police also found children's tea sets and hundreds of children's toys, each of which had been stolen from the graves of the dead children. The detailed notes kept by Anatoly Moskvin meant that the identities of each body could be confirmed. They were between 3 and 29 years old, although only a few, I believe 3 or 4, were adults. However, as we'll get to, it's clear that even the adults he targeted were childlike in appearance. I think this was about him having to make do due to not being able to get access to his primary target, little girls. Each family had to be informed, and they, like the parents of Olga Chardmova, must have been absolutely devastated. Not only had almost all of them lost a child, which is every parent's worst nightmare, but they then had to find out that they'd been turned into whatever these playthings were for this sick, deranged pervert. How many families' lives were turned upside down is not clear. While Moskvin was found with 26 dolls, this was just what he was found with at the time. He'd already reburied some that annoyed him, so I assume they also had to contact parents to let them know that in the grave of their loved one was a mutilated body. On top of this, investigators, using impressions of shoes taken from Moskvin's property, believe that he desecrated around 150 graves. As part of their investigation, the police spoke to Moskvin's parents, and their claims are hilarious. Despite their son living with them for his entire life, they claimed they had no idea what he was up to, with Elvira stating, quote, "We saw these dolls, but we did not suspect there were dead bodies inside. We thought it was his hobby to make such big dolls, did not see anything wrong with it. As to the smell, they'd apparently put this down to an odour coming from the neighbour's property." Both parents also claimed they had potentially not known what was going on because they would often go away for long periods of time, sometimes months. Some articles feed into this bullshit, saying that Elvira and Yuri were completely naive and had no suspicions whatsoever. I mean, first things first, the place stunk of death. If you thought that was coming from your neighbours, you'd complain, not live with the smell for years. Secondly, this was a man in his 20s, 30s and then 40s, apparently collecting and living with dolls. Alarm bells should have been ringing. Even if the dolls didn't raise red flags, wouldn't you think it's creepy that your grown son, who has no children, has tea party sets and children's toys? Lastly, just look at what he did to these poor dead children. These are like something out of a nightmare. Surely the mere sight of his collection should have led to questions. Instead, I think both parents knew exactly what their son was doing, but like when he was a child, it was easy to just ignore the problem than address it. They, as far as I'm concerned, are complicit, and the main reason why Moskvin was able to do this for years. When the news broke about the horrific crimes committed by their son, Elvira and Yuri, were completely ostracised. No one would talk to them. The mob also descended on their home, breaking their windows and writing profanity and insults on their walls. I don't have an ounce of sympathy for either of them. They made no attempts to stop their son. Numerous families were put through hell as a result. Anatoly Moskvin showed no emotion when he was arrested. In fact, he was eager to talk about his accomplishments. The evidence was overwhelming, and he was charged with 44 counts of desecration of graves and dead bodies. The subsequent legal proceedings would show just how twisted and evil this man is. After his arrest, Anatoly Moskvin appeared in court and sickeningly berated the families of the children whose remains he'd mutilated. He told these grieving men and women, quote, "You abandoned your girls. I brought them home and warmed them up." Moskvin was assessed by a psychiatrist and was diagnosed as suffering from schizophrenia, so he was seriously mentally unwell and was suffering from delusional beliefs and thinking, which drove his actions. Specifically, Moskvin apparently believed that the spirits of dead children were calling out to him for help from their graves, and it was his job to exhume their remains and then bring them back to life. Moskvin apparently knew his actions were wrong, but his mission was so important that he felt justified in breaking the law. This assessment is incomplete in my opinion, and later I'll return to what I think was really driving Moskvin, and it's far, far more sinister. Due to this condition, at a hearing on Friday the 25th of May 2012, 45-year-old Anatoly Moskvin was deemed unfit to stand trial, and he was sent to a psychiatric hospital to receive treatment until he was fit to participate in the court proceedings. As of March 2025, Moskvin is aged 58 and remains in confinement to this day. His mental health has been reviewed repeatedly over the last 13 years, but at each stage he's been deemed to still be mentally unwell, too dangerous and unstable to stand before the courts or to be released back into the community. He has never shown any remorse for his crimes and continues to justify his actions to this day. Some people would be happy for Moskvin to stay in confinement for the rest of his life, and this includes Natalia, the mother of Olga Chardmova, who I think echoes the sentiment of many grieving parents, with her saying, quote, "This creature brought fear, terror and panic into my life. I would be happy to know he will spend his life in the hospital. He is a sick person." So this is the third video in a row where the perpetrator is reported to have had a significant mental illness, specifically schizophrenia. This wasn't intentional, it just so happened to be a feature of the case I decided to cover. Again, I preface this section by saying these are my own opinions, and when it comes to serious mental health conditions, this is outside of my sphere of expertise, although I do have experience of working with people with varying levels of mental health conditions. So clearly, Anatoly Moskvin was schizophrenic, but as I've said in previous videos, I think it's important to not assign all of his behaviour to this. I firmly believe this simply magnified extremely concerning traits of Moskvin, which were separate to his mental health condition and present before he became unwell. I think this has clouded how dangerous and depraved he really was, and this is far more sinister than just the dolls that were found in his property. I think that Anatoly Moskvin's claim that he was digging up these children in order to essentially resurrect them is at best incomplete and at worst complete bollocks. Nothing he did was for anyone else but himself. But let's start from the beginning. At the heart of this case is the fact that I have no doubt that Anatoly Moskvin was sexually attracted to female children. All of his behaviour stemmed from this. It's reported that Moskvin was a virgin and never had a relationship. This, I think, was because he lacked the social skills to do so. He was extremely intelligent, but he had no ability to engage with someone his own age, and so he was drawn to children, likely because he could dominate and control them. This, I think, is also why he was drawn to dead bodies. He can completely control a corpse. He could talk to them and touch them, and they would never judge or leave him. Maybe this did link to him being forced to kiss the corpse of an 11-year-old girl when he was 13. This would be the combination of these two factors, young girls and death, and potentially they became indelibly intertwined in his mind. However, I very much doubt this happened. So I did some research, and there was such a thing as a black wedding, which was practiced in some communities in Siberia decades ago, although I cannot see it's a thing now. Anyway, the tradition seemed to involve young men who had died being married to women within their community. This union would last a year, and it was purely symbolic, the deceased being given an opportunity to achieve something they would never be able to experience. With young women or children who died and were unwed, they would be buried in a wedding dress and or in a white coffin. I found no reference of deceased female children or young women being married to men. The practice appears to be the other way around. So there's this point, but also, this appears to have been a ritual in a very specific region of eastern Siberia, which was around 1700 miles away from where Moskvin grew up. So what are the chances that he just so happened to be walking around and come across a ritual that seems to be practiced by a handful of people almost 2,000 miles away from where it's known to have occurred? I smelled bullshit. Instead, I think this was Moskvin relaying his ultimate fantasy, to be married to a dead child. Whilst this is how Moskvin's thinking developed, it's clear that he initially wanted a live child, and this is a terrifying part of this case. He repeatedly tried to adopt a child. Again, he only wanted little girls. I've no doubt this was so he could sexually abuse his child. When his efforts were thankfully hampered, he turned to dead children. In terms of Moskvin digging up children to save them, this is total shit. It's funny how he only stole corpses of female children. What, were male children not worthy of resurrection? Also look at the way he dressed some of the corpses, in stockings, skirts and knee-high boots. Moskvin clearly scoured the obituaries, looking for children he was sexually attracted to, and when he got their corpses, he dressed them in ways which aroused him. Anatoly Moskvin was asked by the police about any sexual abuse of the corpses, which he denied. However, I'm confident this was part of his behaviour. This is why he had the bodies. Yes, he had tea parties with them and sang songs to them, but ultimately, this was about sex. He had a couple of corpses which were adults. From what I've read, these were petite women who looked like children, and I think these were likely obtained due to an unavailability of corpses of young girls. Moskvin was clearly unwell. He likely heard voices of the children and believed that he was having conversations with them, but I'm questioning how relevant his mental illness was to the rest of his behaviour. I'm very sceptical about his claims that he was hoping for some way to resurrect these children. Considering he'd cut into some of them to install music boxes and had sewn buttons into the eye sockets, how would that work? Surely they would be horribly deformed and blind due to what he'd done. I don't think Moskvin wanted the children to be alive. He wanted dead children to control, to abuse. Moskvin was an intelligent man, and I think he knew that admitting the truth that he was sexually attracted to children was the worst thing he could do, and would be the sort of thing that would likely see him being murdered. So anything was better than that, so he concocted this ridiculous story. However, let's consider that I'm wrong. If Anatoly Moskvin truly did believe that he could resurrect these children, why do you think he'd want to do this? To save them? To return them to their families? Absolutely not. If he did think about these little girls coming back to life, I think this was so that he could have sex slaves, multiple children he could abuse again and again and again. Ultimately, whichever way you look at this case is fucked up. Anatoly Moskvin did not kill anyone, but he caused more pain to more people than many of the worst people I've covered on this channel. He is too dangerous and too unstable to ever be in the community again. Even if he were considered well enough one day to be released, I think, as soon as he was able, he would continue to pursue his disgusting sexual interests, and God knows how many more lives he would destroy. So what are your thoughts on this case? If you like the content, then consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button. And you can also send a one-off donation to support the channel using the thanks button. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.